Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank my host for getting me here and facilitating all of the travel, putting us up, all of these things. What I decided to do with this talk was to have us attend to what our theories are, and rather than thinking so much about what is statistically the best method, I want to ask us to move beyond the method and beyond the statistics and say, when we use a particular statistical approach, what is our theory of gender that underlies that? And is that the theory we want to be measuring? Do we want to be reinstating a particular theory by using a particular method, or do we, in fact, need some different method in order to go with our theory of gender? But too often in these studies, gender is not articulated. That is what the theory is, and I felt this in the commentary today that there was no real interrogatory about what gender is to begin with, what we mean when we use the concept of gender. And I'm going to introduce something that's going to be a little bit more difficult, because traditionally statistics treats gender as a static trait. For me, that's a very uninteresting approach to gender, and not a very meaningful one. And instead, I'm going to insist all along that gender is a process, not a trait, which then means we have to go to some more complicated approaches to measure it. So I'm going to, I've taken off on a phrase, an English phrase, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and instead I'm going to start in reverse order and talk about the ugly, that is what I consider some bad examples of how to measure gender, and dig into what the theory is behind the process, and then I'm going to go to the good, and then I'm going to go to what I do, which is the developmental. So my theme is the ugly, the good, and the developmental. The two articles that I'm going to talk about as examples are essentially genetic articles, so the first one is a study that is of masculine girls and feminine boys, genetic environmental contributions to atypical gender development in early childhood. This is a study including one very well-known psychologist, and then one that was just in the news, 2015, and I want to use this more as an example of how, because this was one question that was put out to us, of how results from a scientific paper end up being processed into results for, in this case, a British tabloid. And to show you how meaning changes and how theories of gender change as the processing occurs. So first, and then the good, I'm going to look at two sociologists whose work I admire enormously, Adele Clark, and particularly her book, I'll deal with some of the methods in it, her book Situational Analysis, Grounded Theory After the Postmodern Turn, and a former student of hers, Janet Shim, whose book Heartsick, The Politics of Risk, Inequality, and Heart Disease look at the intersections of race, gender, and class in the production of heart disease and in the healthcare system in the United States. And Shim uses various aspects of Clark's situational analysis, which is it's one very well-founded but less popular sociological approach to analysis. So, and then for the developmental, I'm going to use two psychoanalysts. One is Adrienne Harris, whose book Gender is Soft Assembly I'm very fond of, and it's very, I think, a very worthwhile read. And the other, Ken Corbett's book, Boyhoods, in the plural, notice, rethinking masculinity. So these each one is approaching especially gender in girls and adult women, and the other looking at definitions of masculinity in young boys from a psychoanalytical point of view. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own work, trying to develop more dynamic ways of studying gender in early development. So let me start out with the ugly. With this study by Knafo et al. First, what are the goals of their study? As they stated, they ask what causes atypical gender role development. That's their stated goal, and they choose to measure this by looking at they intend to estimate the proportion of genetic, shared and unshared environment on boys and girls' extreme masculinity and femininity. Their method is to compare monozygotic, that is identical twins, with dizygotic or fraternal twins. And this is a very standard genetic approach in which you make the assumption that the monozygotic twins are genetically identical and therefore ought to be more alike than the fraternal twins who are like any sibling. And you compare frequencies of whatever you're choosing to measure in that way. Of course, it didn't start the clock. Sorry. So, how do they measure gender? The first measurement that they use is parents' reports on masculinity, a subscale of something called the PSAI, or Preschool Activities Inventory. This is, again, a pretty standard approach in psychology. And they have a masculinity subscale, which includes 12 items of the sort listed here: interest in real cars, trains, airplanes, play with swords, play with a tool set. Those are the kinds of items that they say measures masculinity in boys. And particularly these are in preschool. And then the femininity, they look at a subscale 12 items that includes the frequency that child pretend plays a family character, plays with jewelry, or plays house. And as I said, these are parents' reports on their children's activities. And then they have parents' ratings, and so they try to give some differentiation to it, not just an either or. The parents' ratings are on a scale of 1, which is never to 5 very often, summed up separately as either a masculinity or a femininity score. So these are not direct observations of the children, but depend. So here's what, and as I'll mention this a couple times, this is also a theory. So right in here you have a theory of memory involved, because you're depending on parental memory in order to fill this out to begin with. So you have some theory in there which becomes critical in some other examples. So what is their underlying theory? They're actually, in this case, their underlying theory is very confused. Because on the one hand, they keep using the word opposite sex. Throughout the paper, they use that phrase, opposite sex, which suggests that they have a binary theory of gender. That is, it's either Venus or Mars, as Julie explained this common metaphor, at least in the US. But they also introduce arbitrary categories because they understand that actually opposite sex is too broad a theory. So they show us normal distributions that are overlapping, and they decide that they look at a 5% cutoff, a 10% cutoff, and a 15% cutoff to look at most feminine, a little less feminine, a little less feminine, or most masculine, etc. So on the one hand, they have going a continuous theory, it looks like, or a certain amount of arbitrariness, and on the other hand, they have a binary theory in there, and it gets worse. They also have an orthogonal theory that they're using. And none of this is articulated. You have to pull this out of reading the paper. So because they discovered that there were boys who scored high on both the feminine categories and the masculine categories. So they had masculine boys who were also feminine. And the same, they had masculine girls who were, they had feminine boys who were also masculine, and they had masculine girls who also scored high on femininity. So that's not even a binary, that's an orthogonal theory. They never pull apart that theory, what their underlying theory is. And for all of you who are students and postdocs who are young researchers who are going out there to do this kind of work, I think it's essential that you understand what your theory of gender is before you start doing your measurements, or you just end up with a mishmash, which is what I think this is. And of course they have a theory that gender is a trait. It's something fixed, it's something measurable, it's something that if you measure it at time A, it will be the same at time B. And it also, if it's a trait, it's fixed, it's acontextual. So they don't have a contextual theory of gender either. Whereas we actually know that these kinds of behavioral traits in young kids are very context dependent. It depends on whether they're playing alone or with peers, a whole set of things. So, and how many peers and what the personality of the peers are. We know about context of gender expression in toddlers. And they also, in their genetic theory, assume that the contributions to the variance that they're measuring are additive. And again, that's not a great assumption, but that is a standard genetic assumption, that you have heritability and then you plus some environmental, shared environment, plus unshared environment, plus a fudge factor, and they're all additive. And they're supposed to then account for as much of the variance as possible. So let me just go show you their binary measurements. Let me see if I can. That shows you a little bit, just to explode it a little bit. This is up here is their masculinity scale, and down here is their. This is their masculinity score. This is their femininity score. These in black are gender-typical girls, and here as well. And you see that their masculinity score overlaps here, and then, but you also have gender-typical boys in here, and you can do the same here. You see that these areas of overlap are of interest, but then they also have these sort of problematic areas here where they are both masculine and feminine at the same time. Let me just get this down here again. There we go. All right, so this is just to show you what an orthogonal model looks like. A linear model, which is what they part of the time they're working with, has masculinity on one scale in one direction and femininity in another, and you measure, in this case I have a little rat drawn in here, it's either further along the femininity scale or further along the masculinity scale. In an orthogonal model you have masculinity on one axis, femininity on the other axis, and you can have an animal that's high in femininity, or a human that's high in femininity and high in masculinity, or you can have one that's low in both, or you can have anywhere in between. So to begin with, I think at a bare minimum, we need to be using orthogonal models rather than binary or linear models when we're trying to measure gender. So if we move on to this next article, which is where I want to emphasize more how they translate their ideas. Their hypothesis is that there's common genetic factors explain the association between measures of sex typicality, mating success, and homosexuality. And mating success gets very strange here because they're using evolutionary theory, but they're also talking about They're also talking about mating success in evolutionary theory usually involves progeny, but they're using mating success in same-sex couples, and it's not about progeny production, but rather about partnering. And they never address that. It's a strange little thing. So even their evolutionary theory isn't very well articulated. And they're using the same method. Here they're using adults, this group, and again they're looking at monozygotic versus dizygotic twins. And they're looking at 3 things. They're measuring 3 things: sex typicality, the sex of partner preference, and the number of sex partners. And they're measuring sex typicality using a 7-point scale rating, in which, rather in this case, it's not the parents rating them, but the individuals, in the 7-point scale rating is from strongly agree, strongly disagree, as 1 to strongly agree, and these are the kinds of questions that they're asking. Again, there's a theory of memory in here because they're asking to remember how they felt as a child. For example, the kinds of questions. As a child, I was called a tomboy by my peers. Or, as a child, I preferred playing with boys rather than girls. And lastly, as a child, I disliked competitive sports such as football, baseball, and basketball. And so again, they're supposed to remember and do a rating and answer from strongly disagree to strongly agree on a scale, on a 7 increment scale. And as a child, I was a masculine girl. By the way, this study is only on girls, on women. So just so you understand that. So they went from, and what I want to show you here is their results from the research article, and then how they and their university portrayed it in a press release. And there are several slips that happen from statistically, and these are common ones. So the first thing is that while they studied variance, statistical variance, it became variation in the press release. So it lost its statistical meaning and took on a more popular meaning. They measured heritability, which is technically, it's the measure of the genetic component of variance under similar growth conditions. And in the press release, this became genes that determine traits. So that's a big change. It gets worse when the tabloid takes it up, though. Because this is still the university press release reporting where the scientists still had input in what was getting written. Once it gets out into the tabloids, you have no control. And then they used a statistical model, which was a multivariate common pathway model. So they got at the idea that there was a genetic component to the variant in the middle of that common pathway model. And that becomes common genes that underpin 3 traits. So they move from a kind of standard multivariate model to genes. So their unstated theory, let's look at this for a second. Their unstated theories are, first of all, that sexuality, gender, nonconformity, and sexual activity are fixed traits. And again, I want to emphasize where I'm coming from, which is that these are all processual traits. They change with time, they change with context. We cannot treat them as fixed traits in our analyses without just totally going off track. For example, they never looked at age distribution, which would have been an interesting thing to look at. That is, if they had an age-dispersed population instead of a single age cut, their data might have looked quite different. So if they'd stated their own theory to themselves, sorry. And they have as I've mentioned already, they have a non-recursive theory of memory embedded in that retrospective questionnaire, by which I mean they have no idea, they have no theory in which they think that memory accurately reflects something that actually happened at a certain number of years prior, rather than a theory of memory that neuroscientists have who work on memory, which is that memories get stored, they get reopened. When they get reopened, they incorporate new information, they get stored again. There's a recursive notion to memory, and not a one-to-one accessible notion where something that I now remember that happened when I was 5 actually reflects what happened at 5, but it has incorporated my own narratives, my parents' narratives, my brother's narratives, all the different things that have happened to reshape that memory over time. So and this is a problem I have pretty much with all retrospective questionnaires, is that they don't address the question of the problematic of memory, as I think as now contemporary neuroscience is showing pretty clearly it needs to get addressed. So, and they have a genetic theory, but they have no no theory of environmental, of the component. So once they've done their measurement, they do have a whole residual bunch of stuff that they say is environmental, but they have a theory of that there have to be these common genes, but they never articulate what their environmental theory is. So they have no hypothesis about what the environment could be, even though they know they have to put it in there to make that variance add up to, or to make their account of the variance add up to 100 or 1. But they never articulate a theory. So they have no theory of environment that they're willing to articulate. All right, so what happens when it gets into the to the Daily Mail? Let me see if I can. All right, get this. There we go. So in the Daily Mail, here's what happens. It is tomboy genes. So now we have a name for these genes that were really only a heritability component linked to promiscuity. So mating success becomes promiscuity, which is in itself a very gendered term, as you know. And so more masculine girls have more lovers, whether they are straight or gay. And then it says what they found: researchers quizzed pairs of twins over sexuality and number of lovers. They found that genes that control masculinity also control promiscuity. So we have a whole control component that gets added in to the newspaper report. And they have a percentage. So findings show that 30% of women's sexuality is determined by genes. So just to then rehearse this for you, they have heritability becomes tomboy genes. Tomboys become masculine girls, but not women, even though these are studies done on adults. There's no mention of the orthogonal nature of masculinity and femininity. So although you can infer that from the original research paper, that has disappeared altogether by the time you get here. And variance becomes a percentage, that is 30% of women's sexuality. That is, so it becomes the actual trait rather than the variance within the trait. And then genes now are determining traits, which the original authors themselves wouldn't agree with if you challenge them. So this is the kind of thing that's out there in the literature a lot, but there are other and better methods to approach these kinds of studies, and I'm going to move us now more into the social sciences by talking about Adele Clark and Janet Shim's work. So what they do and there's a whole bunch of different approaches that's in Clark's methods textbook, but I'm going to choose one, situational analysis, which she talks about as part of grounded theory. And what she does is try not to start with presumptions about what's going on, and instead starts by trying to map the constitution of meaning. To begin with, you'll see these are not statistical maps, but then the trick would be to try, if you wanted to do measurement at some later point. So this is her approach to start with is more of a qualitative sociology, but it's a very methodical one. So she uses situational maps and articulates the elements in the situation and starts to examine relations among them. This becomes critical if you want to understand gender again as a process, as not as a fixed trait. Because she and Shim, as you'll see, work point of view into the process. So Clark starts with what she calls a messy map, and let me get this up here again. So she's looking at, she's using her student Janet Chim's, or her former student Janet Chim's, study of cardiovascular disease incidence in women and by race. If you do just standard health disparity statistics, you'll see that African Americans have a much higher rate of cardiovascular disease in the United States, and women have supposedly a lower rate of cardiovascular disease in certain age cohorts. So to begin with, you just start writing down all of the different things that you think are relevant to what's going on, and at all different levels of organization. So there are structural things, the Office of Minority Health Research, the inclusion rules for the National Institutes of Health Studies, class, socioeconomic, sex, gender, activist groups, women's health organizations and movements, discourses of individualism. So these are the I choose to smoke or I choose not to smoke. So public health campaigns that are aimed at changing individual behavior, medical technologies, all of these different, we have statistics in here, all of these different things that are contributing to the production of a discourse about differences in cardiovascular disease. You can then order these, so she just does this very, very quickly into individual human elements. And any of these things are things people publish statistical studies about. Collective human elements and actors, these are all these different organizations, political economic elements, sociocultural symbolic elements, spatial elements like local and regional variations, especially with regard to race, ethnicity, and healthcare, related discourses. From there, you can make situational, relational maps. And what Shim does that's very interesting is that she asks, how does the world look from the point of view of public health workers, and particularly epidemiologists, that is the statisticians, and how does the world look and how is it interpreted from the point of view of the people who have cardiovascular disease. And you get two different maps with two different points of view if you do this. So if you focus on epidemiology, in this first example, you see here you have the mainstream epidemiology, which does clinical cardiovascular disease research. They have various discourses and various theories about race and gender. They have databases that they use, which come from various places. hanging out here is the question of drugs and how you decide to treat or address cardiovascular research. But you have everything looked at from the point of view of the statistical world and all of the different organizations and pressures that pressure epidemiologists to produce certain kinds of data. If you look at this, though, from the point of view of the perspective of persons of color, then you have down here, you start here, people of color who have cardiovascular disease, and they have their own discourses about what's going on. They have identity politics discourses, they have victim blaming discourses, they have their own histories that matter. The Tuskegee experiments are a particularly notorious set of experiments done in the United States that have made people of color kind of forever distrust the healthcare process in the U.S. So on the one hand, you have the epidemiologists creating a story in which you say, well, blacks are not responsible about getting medical care in a timely fashion. And that partly accounts for their higher death rate from cardiovascular disease, because they only come in when the situation is really dire. On the other hand, you have people of color saying, there's a reason we don't go for health care until the end, because there's a really bad negative history in which we've been mistreated and not treated properly when we come in. So if we summarize this, we can see the kinds of things that come up. Looking first from the point of view of epidemiologists, you see that race as a category is treated as a scientific category. The race is operationalized by epidemiologists as cultural difference at kind of the individual level. That is, there's a culture in which people don't eat the right diet. There's a culture in which people don't exercise properly and they don't seek medical help in a timely fashion. That's their explanation of racial difference. And that means that their health advocacy targets become individual lifestyle. Public health campaigns will focus on diet, on eating, not eating fried food, that kind of thing. And when you get to gender as a category, gender gets treated as an absolute binary. Biological difference is seen as explaining the differences in cardiovascular disease, especially differences in hormone biology. And gender is conceptualized, it's just coded as a 1 or a 2 in SPSS. That's it. That's your gender. That's the absolute binary. You're either a 1 or a 2. And then then the health advocacy targets become pharmaceutical solutions. So you should take estrogen or not take estrogen. You take one of the cholesterol-lowering drugs, all of those kinds of things. If, on the other hand, you look at it from the point of view of lay people who have cardiovascular disease, race then becomes a lived identity. If they did interviews with people of color who had cardiovascular disease and asked them why they thought they had the disease, and they had a whole story about what it's like to live as a black person in the United States and how that produces stress, how that produces poverty, how that produces the impossibility of living in places where you can't get fresh food, what we call food deserts in big cities, where there are whole areas where there are no grocery stores that sell food worth eating. Then they operationalize race themselves, not as cultural difference, but as structural, relational, intersectional processes of racialization. So they talk about how race is reprocessed in their own bodies by their lived experience. Then the health advocacy targets become food availability, neighborhood safety, stress from experienced racism. These are all much more structural things. How do you get a grocery store or a food truck that sells fresh food into an inner city neighborhood? For gender, because of course some of the people of color with cardiovascular disease are women, for gender, they also see an absolute binary, biological differences, especially hormone biology, but when they conceptualize gender, they don't code it as a 1 or a 2. They see it in terms of relations of power and in their intersections with race and class. So there's a much more process-oriented self-concept of gender and how it feeds into what's going on in their own bodies. And then the health advocacy target becomes, for gender, changing the structural causes of sex-specific stress. For example, violence against women, the double shift of working a job and doing all the work at home, lower pay, which then changes your class status and makes life more difficult. So by taking these two different points of view, then a much different sense of what you mean by gender and what you want to be trying to measure, and then what the advocacy outcomes of that are. So let's move on to the developmental. And I'm going to start with Adrienne Harris's work. Her book is really, it's a great read. So she is a practicing psychoanalyst, and there's one part of the book in which she looks at tomboy identity and argues that it's softly assembled and its experience varies. And I think this is one of the, it's nice to use this as a counterpoint to the Burry et al., the 2015 article that I talked about under the ugly heading, because they both use that notion of tomboy, but Harris gives it profound nuance, and not a 1 to 7 scale based on memory of childhood, although she is working with adults, so they are also processing memory, but of course a psychoanalyst's understanding of memory and how it works is rather different, because they don't presume there's a 1-to-1 correlation with what actually happened. So she argues that the tomboy identity is softly assembled and its experience varies, and I'll say a bit about what this means. So, for example, she says the state of mind for gender transgression, that is being a tomboy as a girl, can be transcendent, that is, it can be a source of enormous power, and it can also be terrifying. So, and it could be the same thing in the same girl at different points that are under different circumstances. So being a tomboy does not imply a single state of mind, but rather a whole variety of states of mind. The tomboy athlete, for example, uses cultural and physical space to express acceptable forms of motility and aggression. So that's another way in which being a tomboy provides a place for self-expression within the constraints of being a girl in societies where using physical space is more constricted or is less acceptable. Being aggressive is less acceptable for being a girl. And she also goes on to say that tomboys can be, being a tomboy, it can be an excessive behavior, and it can be a conveyor and bearer of jouissance, and she uses the French term because in English, there isn't really a good term in English, but I think if you were going to translate what she means mostly in English, you'd use the word enjoyment, although it has the meaning of orgasm as well in the French. So it's a richer word in French, and that's one reason American feminists, post-structural feminists, use this in rather more complex ways because the English fails in this case. So a tomboy may contain and express both masculine and feminine desires, both as object and subject. So being a tomboy allows both kinds of positional subjects. And again, I think this is an important aspect of gender that we don't really measure enough. And then lastly, being a tomboy may open up personal space to move and act unanchored by binary categories. So it's a way of rejecting binary categories. So if we want to understand tomboyism from the point of view of psychoanalysis, we see that it's a complex category, and it allows a kind of behavioral space and an emotional space for girls that not being a tomboy does not allow. And it can be both positive and negative. So she complicates the story. And here I'll add in two other notes. One is that being a tomboy is a process, again, not a trait, that affords both stability but also change, and that for psychoanalysis, and particularly for her work, the focus is on individuals, not on group properties. So she treats tomboyism as an individual property. So hence the same work gets interpreted individually in terms of specific life histories, rather than the kind of statistical notion of the use of tomboy in the genetics paper that I started out with. So Harris then turns to what I've been using, which is dynamic systems theory, in order to imagine the multiplicities of developmental outcomes. So first of all, gender, she argues, is not a structure, but is a softly assembled process. And it's a set, by which she means it's a set of behavioral attractors whose form and stability vary depending on a number of different things. The task at hand, that is, whatever it is that gender is being employed to accomplish, whether it's a psychological task or a physical task of some sort. The context of the gendered behaviors, and the life history of the individual who's behaving. So, and this is a critical part of dynamic systems theory, that there is a recursive story to be told, so that you're always building at time t, at age 10, you're building on what's happened at age 5 or 0 to 9. So you're continually, you always have the building blocks that are with you, and then you build further, you change further, but within the context or within the constraints of what's gone before. And I think we can get back to this afternoon, but I think this is an important approach that we need for understanding things like mortality rates of the sort that we saw in the commentary. That is the mortality rate at 60 develops recursively from things that have happened at 50 and 40 and 30 and 20. So you can't take different age cohorts as being independent of one another. And then, of course, individual experience. So this approach privileges experience and variability in individual pathways. And it does not seek a single or a binary norm. So this is Harris's approach, which is primarily psychoanalytic. Using dynamic systems, it veers very much away from that notion of a single norm, which produces challenges to measurement, which I think we can talk about this afternoon. But I think there are challenges that are essential to meet and to grapple with. So Ken Corbett has worked on feminine boyhood. So he also is a psychoanalyst, and he has worked with children who are brought to him by parents who are concerned about their boys being too feminine. And he's also works with adults who have had feminine boyhoods and who are now processing what that means to them in adulthood. And he suggests that identifications stimulate intricate feedback loops, so he also has a dynamic approach to development, in which genders, and he uses the plural, constructed through the transfer and internalization of a series of things. That is, you can look at things like traits, which are contribute to an internalization of gender. There's feedback loops. So in children, a trait can be something like long hair versus short hair, which is information that toddlers use to construct stories about gender. Various codes of gender, and here an example of dresses versus pants, wearing jewelry or not jewelry. These are aspects of, these are codes of gender that young children begin to use. Behaviors are used in this. We saw this in that behavioral scale that I had in earlier on. Sensitive versus rough becomes gendered. It becomes a measure of gender, and aggression versus non-aggression. And fantasies. So there are things that go on in children's head, fantasies of surrender, fantasies of domination, which are also components of how genders become constructed through the transfer of information about these levels of organization of our world. I think that would be a way of looking at it, and how they become transferred and internalized. So Corbett looks at how boys create the space within masculinity for feminine masculinity. So he's arguing that there's a bigger space that can get called masculinity, but that there's also within that something that he's calling feminine masculinity. So this is femininity within masculinity. So he's not, he's not setting these up as oppositional, because in the linear model you couldn't have this drawing. Because femininity would have to be outside of masculinity. It would be in opposition to it. This, for me, just brought to mind a series of images, which I'll just expand them a little bit at a time. But so we have this rough and tumble play kind of thing versus the sensitive, within the feminine masculinity, a child stroking a kitty very affectionately. We have two kinds of cowboys. We have the masculine cowboy, and we have the pink cowboy hat, which they're both cowboy hats, but one is seen within a realm of femininity, and one is seen within a realm of masculinity. We have different forms of dress. We have the typical boy dress, and then a girl's dress. So we have, and certainly there are boys who like to wear girls' dresses, and others who wouldn't be caught dead in them. We have the act of play, and a boy kicking a soccer ball, and here we have children climbing a tree. And I've left it a little bit overlapping with the feminine masculinity, because that's a very typical, in the girls' world, a very typical tomboy activity to be climbing a tree. So it's something that clearly straddles the feminine and the masculine as a defined behavior. And then we have dress up here. Because of the lighting, I don't think you can see, but this little boy is wearing very large, very bright red high heels, possibly from his mother. And then you finally have two forms of behavior. This little boy with the toolbox, very defined as straight out masculine. And then you have this little boy with a doll and a set of parents who are worried and scratching their head at the little boy playing with the doll. So you have this constellation of things, and and what he's arguing is that, first of all, they mix and match in different ways, but that they need to be understood as being part of both a big construction of masculinity within which there are permissible, from his point of view, realms of feminine masculinity that little boys engage in, but then get structured in different ways as they move on into adulthood. All right, I'm going to make a switch now from this kind of more individual psychoanalytic narrative to the work that I'm doing, because I want to suggest that there are ways in which we can try to take individual stories, and by dealing especially developmentally, we can begin to look at them statistically. So the first thing is that we need to always visualize change over time. And to show you what these graphs are, these are actually the behaviors of mothers of sons or mothers of daughters. And each colored line is an individual mother or an individual family. Really, you have to think of it as a dyad. These lines are always two people together, the infant and the mother. And these are the age of the children in weeks. And so the first thing that strikes you is this huge variability. There's all this variability. This is the mothers of boys, and what we're measuring is affectionate touch, and the duration of affectionate touch in a 5-minute period in which we've been measuring second by second. So this is 300 seconds of data over 3 months to 12 months, so 9 months of measurements taken every other week. So it's a big, rich longitudinal set. And there's a regression line drawn through here. There's this black one is, and I'll show you a little bit more in a minute so you can see it better. And I won't tell you for a minute about the significance of the lines. But the point is that we start out with this huge amount of data. We have individual families, and we want to find ways to see what's going on individually, but also see if we can make any bigger conclusions about the behaviors of mothers in dyadic interaction with their infants. So we start by looking at individual differences. Here we've just taken that same data and smoothed out the lines. So here now we have average regression lines for each family. And again, we have the mothers of girls over here, the mothers of boys over here. And again, you can't see it very well, but there is a single black regression line for everything in here. But if you stare at it for a while, you'll begin to see individual family patterns and maybe some differences in scatter between the mothers of sons and the mothers of daughters. Now, if we add in the neat-looking line, the publishable lines, what you see here are the regression lines in green for the girls of the duration of affectional touch with age of the child for girls, and the dotted lines are the standard deviations, and for the boys here. And what you can see here is that especially in the younger months, mothers are giving a greater amount of affectionate touch to their sons than other mothers are to their daughters. But you also see that changes with time, so that the amount of affectionate touch declines with time, which is not very surprising. A mother handling an infant who's essentially immobile is very different from a mother handling a toddler. But they begin to meet. If you were to not do a longitudinal study and you just did your measurement over here, say at 9 months or at a year, you'd say, oh, mothers treat their sons identical to daughters. But if you look at the pattern over time, you see that there's a trait. That there's a process that's both true for children and also somewhat different for boy children and girl children. So this approach still allows us to do, and I don't want you to try and actually read these graphs, so I'll expand this for a sec. So allows us to look at one behavior at a time, which is still a problem, I think. So just to give you an idea of the kind of things we've looked at, we've done these graphs for different infant behaviors. So these are infants lying down, rolling over, infants kicking, infants lying still, and this is frequency and duration. The actual differences here, there are some differences, but they're not. The main point is that you can look at dozens of different individual behaviors this way, and you can also look at maternal behaviors the same way, and again, you can look at the framework, the motor social framework. You can look at passive play. You can look at how much they're not playing. All of these are different maternal play frame codes. So you can look at lots of individual behaviors this way. And you do get information from the longitudinal point of view, but you don't really get too much about several things going on at once. And obviously lots of things are going on at once. So we've been experimenting with trying to look at least at 3 things at once. Yeah, it's too bad it's so light in here because these don't show up that well. I'm afraid on the big screen. They're beautiful right down here. But if we look at, here, 3 to 4 months duration, and here I've got 3 different maternal behaviors going on at once. So we have maternal vocalization on one axis, affectionate touch on one axis, and assisted locomotion on one axis. So each of these individuals, and then I've put the scatter plots in. So the red squares are the mothers of girls, and the blue dots are the mothers of boys. And you can see, and then I've also overlaid the surface diagrams that we have. I can show this is at 3 to 4 months. This is at 5 to 6 months. This one's a little easier to read, where you have this is the grid for the boys. This is the grid for the girls. And you can see that there are different distributions. But so you have here a child who's not getting very much affectionate touch. They're getting a lot of vocalization, and they're not being moved around a lot. Whereas up here, you have one, also a girl, by the way, who's getting somewhat less vocalization, quite a lot of assisted locomotion, and also quite a lot of affectionate touch. And then, wait, let's go back down here. And then this graph here is the same kind of data at 7 to 8 months, and what you see, and at 7 to 8 months duration. So you can begin to ask a little. You can begin to look at these by asking. And so I've drawn some lines through here that sort of separate out individuals on one side of the line versus individuals on the other side. So the individuals on this side of the line, and you can draw the line in different ways, but you can also get at these lines by doing something called a cluster analysis, and ask how these children cluster. And so first you put all of the data in together and ask, are there clusters of families where there's a lot of affectionate touch and a lot of talking, but not much moving the child around? Are there clusters of families where there's less affectionate touch, but a lot of talking, etc.? So you can ask your computer program to spin you out clusters using all the data together, and then you can ask whether those clusters are differentiated, whether mothers of boys and mothers of girls are present in different frequencies in different of the clusters. But here now you've moved from individual traits or individual behaviors to suites of behavior. And this, I started to show this to you before, but let me just show it again. All right. So the main point here is to show you that that there isn't a strict male or female belonging on one side or the other. So here you have a female who, as I said, is getting a fair amount of maternal vocalization, but quite a lot of affection and assisted locomotion. So you can compare her. And there are very few females, by the way, on this side of the line. But you can compare her, or this mother, to the mother of this girl, who, as I said, is chattering up a storm to her daughter, but is not moving her very much and not touching her very much. And on the other hand, you could look at two different mothers of two different boys, where they're not talking to them much, and they're giving them a lot of affectionate touch, but they're not moving them much. This one versus this one, who's getting quite a lot of talk, quite a lot of affectionate touch, and is also getting moved around quite a lot. So by beginning to try to look at several traits at once and to visualize what's going on with multiple traits, you can get a sense of both distribution of individual patterns, but also aggregate differences in gender, in which you can also say, in gendered behaviors, in which you can also say, well, they're clearly not absolute if you look at these. They're individual family patterns, but there are also bigger patterns that emerge from doing this kind of graphing. So I want to finish up with something that's pretty new to me and pretty unfamiliar to me. It's being done in collaboration with a colleague at Grinnell, Damien Kelty-Stephen, and a student of his. And they use something which is, it comes from actually economic modeling, which is kind of cute. But given the constellation of people we have here today, something called VAR IRF modeling, which I barely understand, but I will try to explain it to you. But it's been done on my data set. So a VAR system consists of a set of some number of variables, which it's called, a VAR is vector autoregression, and it's a skeleton model of how variables interact over time. So in the previous graphs, I was three-dimensional, so that gives me 3 variables. But there's more than 3 variables going on. Ideally, you'd want to have measurement systems in which you can look at quite a number of variables and model their possible effects. So the VAR system consists of a certain number of variables, each of which is expressed as a linear function of lags of itself. So you look at the function at time 1, and then at time 2 and time 3, or you look at what happens as time moves on. And this looks something like this, where, let me see if I can get this over here. So you have here, with the red, you have these are data on infant behavior from my work that I shared with Damien and his student. And this is the duration of infants banging. So we're looking at, how little infants just start banging on the table or whatever with their coffee cup. I hope not. With their sippy cup, let's just say. And here we have an illustration of the duration of infants walking independently. And this is at time, the start of time starts here, and then time plus 1, plus 2, etc., with age of development going this way. And then you can ask whether infant banging at time at I-1, as they have it here, either affects infant banging at at I, or you can ask whether infant banging at I minus 1 affects infant independent walking at I. And you can do the same for walking. You can ask whether infant walking at I minus 1 affects it at I, and you can also cross to the other behavior. And in doing this, you can build up networks of behaviors. You can add in more and more variables and start creating what is actually a web of behaviors. So, and that's shown here, where you can, here we've added in infant banging duration, infant walking independent, and infant reaching duration. So in here you can, so each one of these is symbolized, the solid is time I, the not solid is time I minus 1, and you can ask, in each case, does it affect itself later? Does it affect either of these other traits later? And you can see that you could build down a really big web of potential interactions this way. This is all then, of course, modeled with equations, and it's the equations that are beyond me. It's this sort of general theory I can tell you about. But so then we add in the IRF part of it. So that was the vector autoregression part of it. And the IRF is impulse equals impulse response function. And so the question is, what happens at time 2 in the web if we pull one of these strings at time 1? Some of you may remember or have played a string game called Cat's Cradle, where you start as little children, you start out with strings, just a string just very loosely on 2 fingers, and then a friend grabs them and goes like this, and then you go like this, and you make all these different shapes. So you can use that maybe as a metaphor for what's getting asked here. Or if you want to use this kind of drawing, we can look here in what we're asking here. What happens, for example, if we pull on this string here at time I minus 1 to either this other trait here or to the same trait later. So they did this for some of my data. Not all of it, because they're just, and I think we'll do more of this, but we already had with the beginning some pretty interesting results. And I think, let me expand this again. Start here. They looked at five bits of data: infant banging duration, infant walking independent, infant reaching, and then mothers assisting locomotion and mothers touching. And the dotted lines that represent, if you increase at time 1, it leads to a decrease at time 2. If you increase, or the solid line is if increase led to an increase, and then there was no effect. And this first drawing just shows you how that would look if you, and this is all color coded, so if you did this, it might change this. But if we look at the second drawing, this is what we found. They found 2 examples in which there was an effect. And this was walking independently had 2 effects. It affected infant walking independently affected maternal touch, so it resulted in an increase in maternal touch, and it resulted also in an increase in maternal's assisting locomotion. So an infant behavior at time 1 led to, and these are short timelines, by the way, we're not talking months difference, but short timelines. So led to 2 different maternal behaviors, apparently in response to the infant walking. We can see that on the next slide. Oop. Wait. No, that's right. Where if we look especially over here, so the IRF VAR with boys walking, so if you pulled here at time 1, it increased these maternal behaviors at time 2. And it was true for boys, but not for girls. So that's where the gender comes in. So that is, the mothers did not respond, mothers of girls did not respond to their girls' independent walking by helping them or touching them more. Mothers of boys responded by touching them more and helping them walk. So this is just the very early days of this analysis. We've got a lot of other traits we want to look at, or behaviors we want to look at, and we need to ask more questions about what the actual time intervals involved are. This is a modeling system. It's not, but it's based on the data, the actual observational data that I provided them with. So it's this kind of approach that I think is going to give us very different accounts of what gender is. And in this case, gender is part of a dyad. It's not even an individual trait, but it's something about how mothers and their children interact together. So let me close with the following summaries. First, gender is a process, not a thing. I think that's essential to any work we do with gender, is to try and understand how it works as a process before we start to measure it, because it's going to tell us to measure. We start thinking processually, then we're going to want to measure things that we maybe didn't otherwise want to measure. Second, gender is not an individual property, so it can only be analyzed within a defined context. So we need to always define what our context is, and that could be a micro context, for example, a family, a meso context, that is the social world, maybe peers and age groups, or a macro, that is culture. So any particular culture has a strong definition of what appropriate gender behaviors are. So we have to also be thinking about, it's not necessarily that we can do all of them at once, but we have to be thinking about what our context is. We have to articulate our theory as part of our measurement activity. Gender processes change over time within individuals and historically. So that's another aspect of process. I've submitted some of this data for publication, and it is as I like to say, in litigation right now. So the article came back with an offer for me to resubmit it, but one of the criticisms I got on this particular paper, which was doing a lot of this visualization work, was that the data set that I was using is old, and so maybe gender's changed now, so I have to justify why it's okay to use an older data set. And I think that's fair enough. I should justify it. But that's, I think, an important point. What counts as being girly in 1950 doesn't count as being girly in 2015 for either a boy or a girl. And gender has multiple components which may vary independently and which may be linked. So the idea of using models that are strictly additive, I think, is not a good one. We need to be thinking about interactive models. And that's one of the things that I find very attractive about this, VAR-IRF modeling system. And I think using theoretical models to model behaviors is a great thing to do, because it gives us a better idea of how to collect data, where to collect the data from. But we need to understand, we need to be thinking interactively, and if we don't have the best statistics to do it, then we have to be making some new statistics. I think that's actually at the heart of one of the challenges of measuring gender in traditional fields like psychology and I presume in economics, although I know that less well, is that the statistical models available maybe aren't the right ones. And then and maybe the right ones don't even exist. Or you have to start teaming up with statisticians to make new models that work better. And then finally, when analyzing gender, we should not be eschewing time, dynamics, and complexity. That is, we should not be trying to simplify those matters out of existence, but we should be reaching for them. They should be an important part of our analysis. Or we will get data, statistical significance, and not much applicability in the real world. So, that's it.
So I think it's, thank you very much for talking. Unfortunately, Nina Lucke can't be here today. And I think it's much more interesting if we actually start with the questions right now, instead of me reading her answer. Her answer is, probably most of you know what that would have been. And so,
only on it. You can show me later.
Yeah, definitely I will. But hopefully some of you can take up what her answer might have been. So I'll leave the floor open to anybody who'd like to have questions, or anybody has. Yes.
Yeah. Hello, thank you very much for a nice piece. My name is Christina Fie. I'm one of the Aarhus researchers. I'm curious to get you to elaborate more on the idea of the context. What is our context, which was one of your concluding comments. This idea of class, ethnicity, race, sexuality, socioeconomic conditions. How does that interact with your idea of theory and context? I'm also thinking here of differences, for instance, between Europe and the US, Northern Europe, the US, Asia, etc. They get some of these differences into play.
Well, I'm not sure what. I mean, in a way, you've just mentioned all the different kinds of contexts that we need to start including in our studies, or at least, as I said, expressing straight out up front our theory of context. So we may do a study in which it's culturally limited. I mean, the study I'm doing, it's very culturally limited. And so all you can say about my study is that it can set up a set of questions that could be asked better by adding in more context. So I think, so one of the things about context is saying what it is, trying, depending on whether it's a very small study or a much larger study, you can have more or less context. You may need to do 5 studies cross-culturally to get at certain kinds of things. Within the United States, I mean, there's just, it's such a heterogeneous population that to begin with, you can begin to include context by choosing subjects from different parts of the same city who will be, you know, first-generation children of immigrants from Central America versus fourth-generation or more, you know, Mayflower descendants from the British colonists. You know, you can do, in a country the size of the United States, you can do a lot with the population that's there in terms of big picture. You can, you want to always, not always, but it's a good idea to look at, to articulate, again, this micro, macro, micro, meso, macro context, because they're very different. So micro within the family, this data set, which is a data set that it's a found data set, it was collected by a colleague for a totally other reason. And what he did, which was a standard psychology practice, was he limited it to firstborn children, he limited it to middle-class children, he limited it to white children. So he created his micro context and to stay-at-home mothers. So he created a family, and he did this to try to have as little variation as possible. That's something psychologists often do. It's a standard practice. So, so what he did was he created a very constrained micro context. Whatever results you get out of that, you might then want to say, all right, well, what happens if we have, and there are some studies like this, if we have behaviors of a third-time mother where there's an older brother and an older sister, or an older brother, or two older sisters. What happens when there's a man who's the main caregiver? A question I get a lot now, given the increased frequency of families where both parents are either women or both parents are men, is what happens when you have same-sex parents? These are questions that now couldn't have been asked 20 years ago, but could be asked now. So if you're doing a study where you have a very limited context, then first of all, you can't overinterpret it. And you have to treat it really as a pilot study to ask the questions better. First, within what kinds of variability in family micro context, then at the meso level, I mean, what happens with children who really go to, say, to creches, to daycare from the time they're little infants until nursery school, versus kids who are raised home alone. A whole series of things you can begin to ask at that middle level, and then of course you have the big macro cultural questions.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
You're welcome.
My question relates to how, or if we should escape the gender binary when we ask questions in order to measure gender. And I heard you talking positively about Corbett and his concept of feminine masculinity. But at the same time, you said we should be cautious not to, when we look at variance, not just to treat it in an additive way. And I remember your own work of the 5 sexes, where you actually try to challenge this gender binary. So when we look for clusters, are we just adding on the poles of the gender binary, or should we start to engage more genders when we look for clusters?
Well, two points. First of all, Corbett's work, he's using these are words that we have that we have to deal with. I mean, so these are words where a patient comes in or parents come in and are using this language to describe behaviors. But his work is definitely not, he's arguing not that these are additive, but rather that these are orthogonal concepts, and that you can have, that's why he's using the plural masculinities, and talking about what gets called feminine as being potentially part of a masculinity. So he's not trying to separate out the boys from the girls, as it were, but rather trying to expand the notion of masculinity to include a wider variety of behaviors, a spectrum of behaviors, a continuum, if you would, of behaviors that are all things that boys do to greater or lesser degrees, and are not necessarily cause for alarm, or shouldn't be cause for alarm. Now, the cluster information is interesting because you start out with a whole data set, and you first ask whether there are clusters which show up. And then you can ask, you can ask whether there are 2 clusters, 3 clusters, 4 clusters. So you can just punch in the number of divisions you want, and see where you get sensible data and where the data becomes kind of nonsensical. So that's one thing that you can do, and then you can ask about participation in, that is, frequency of different groups in different clusters. Now, I only have mothers of boys and mothers of girls to start with in my data set. If you added in, and this gets back to the prior question, so if you had a different data set where you had mothers of firstborn girls, mothers of firstborn boys, mothers of boys with older siblings. You know, you could add some complexity in there and then ask the same set of questions. And you might get, I think you'd get rather different kinds of behaviors, because I'm pretty sure the mother of someone, when it's their third child, doesn't behave the same way as they did when it was their first child. And anyone here who has more than 2 children probably know I'm right about that. So you can begin to work complexity in. In my data set, I can't. It's too simple a set. So really what I'm doing with this work is suggesting how we could approach a more complex data set in a more complex fashion. But not, I really don't feel like I have answers, but rather I'm suggesting suggesting pathways for future analysis. Annalise?
If we start, as you suggested, expanding these behaviors in this huge multiplicity, does it still make any sense at the end to call the boys boys and the girls girls? And if yes, based on what should we still call them boys and girls?
So, for those of you who couldn't hear, the question is, if we begin to expand this out and we get shadings of behaviors, does it make any sense in the end to call the boys boys and boys girl and girls girls, and based on what basis? So maybe in an ideal world, no. I mean, maybe gender as a way of organizing the world begins to drop away at some point. That's possible. It's a very early learned category because it's one of the first categories that children are confronted with, and it will be it's going to be very interesting to do these kinds of studies. We have studies from the 80s and 90s of at what age infants start to be able to distinguish, say, deep voices from high voices. And then at what age they begin to be able to associate a deep voice with a male face, a masculine face. And it's very young, so infants start building categories at 5, 6, 7 months that are based on the adults in their world, male adults and female adults. So one interesting question would be, what if the primary caretakers are both men or both women? What happens to the gender categories with those children? When do they build them? How do they build them? So cognitively, gender may be a very basic, by which I mean early formed, way of distinguishing the world, and of forming organizing the world for children. But there may be nothing magic about it being gender. It may just be the first thing kids see in their world that gives them some purchase on telling the difference between one thing and the other thing. So I'm not answering, I don't have a should. I think it's more actually a developmental question to be answered empirically, is will these categories change over time? Is it a useful category to analyze? It depends on what we're trying to figure out. I don't know if that helps or not. Yes.
Thank you very much. I thought this was 2 extremely interesting talks. And I wonder whether to some degree there is almost like a shift away from the ontology, what is gender, into maybe almost a epistemological question, not so much when is gender measurable, but how can one come about starting to look at it if these things are not binary by nature, but mosaic or complex or something like that. I mean, is this what we're looking at, not so much the essence of it, but really saying, well, if we have these complex phenomena, what kind of tools do we need to get at these things here? Would you see that as a general move?
Yes, I think that's a great question. Because gender is it's not a static phenomenon, and it's a complex phenomenon. So the question is exactly that: what kinds of tools do we need to measure them? And I started out sort of building up with. I mean, I started out saying what not to do, but But I started out then building up using the work of qualitative sociology, which is to assess what's out in there in the world and begin to build maps based on what we're seeing in the world. And those maps that, that Clark and Shim build are, again, they have all these different levels of organization in them. And then to begin to build how connections work. And then finally ask, all right, here's what our map looks like. What do we want to know? In the case of differences, either racial differences or health or gender differences in health outcomes, obviously what we want in the end is to figure out how to stop people from dying prematurely of heart disease in this example. So then the model that we've built begins to tell us where to look for the answers. And so one place to look is drugs. If you have one model, another place to look is structural inequality, social inequality, if you have another model. So you always, I think, have a kind of recursion about, so if your study is being funded by a pharmaceutical company, you're likely to structure your study in a different way than if it's being funded by a social activist group, if only they had money to fund studies. But I think you've stated the question very well, and that's why I wanted us to step back away from, what's a good statistical method, and back into what are we thinking about gender anyway.
But to follow up then, someone who was trained in social anthropology in the early 90s, this thing about gender being a process, being basically relational, not an individual property, rings very familiar bells to the type of kind of post-structuralism that we had beaten into our bodies at that time. And I think it was a good thing. So is what we are seeing now that really economics and biology is also becoming post-structural? Is this a gender intervention happening in these fields too? It has different implications once you kind of do it in different methods, but you can say the basic metaphors or the basic understandings seem so similar to what people in humanities would have said like in the 90s in a postmodernist, post-structuralist training.
Well, I won't speak for economics except that I guess they're not becoming post-structural. Biology is an interesting question, and of course I've moved out of biology into this area of behavior, which is really psychology, which is not originally my training at all. But I actually think that biology is an interesting place to work because biologists actually have pretty non-determined, if you really push them, and particularly behavioral biologists who work on animals, they have pretty non-deterministic approaches to sex, to sexual development. And they do understand how physiology changes over time. So that what I often see is that social scientists use like 1950s biology, which is very deterministic and fixed, and apply it as biology says that, fill in the blank. And that their biology is out of date by 40 years. And it just makes me want to pull out my hair. So it's interesting that in a way, I don't know if biologists would roll their eyes if you said they were post-structuralists. But biology has had, by virtue of the fact that they're now having to deal with huge data, they have these huge data sets, huge amounts of information, they're developing a whole new set of techniques which are much more open-ended and amenable to multiple inputs. So using network analysis, is one example. And this whole area of computational biology is opening up new, and I think it's one place we'll be drawing, people who work on gender will be drawing mathematical techniques from to apply to the emergence of gender. So they're interested in phenotype and the emergence of new traits. I saw that.
Thank you very much for coming, and a big thank you to Fausto-Sterling.